התפללתי אל הנער הזה וייתן השלי יש אלוהי אשר שובלתי
Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. Wasn't that spectacularly beautiful? That song, it's a song of a father being grateful for the gift of his son. It's called El Hanar, and it's sung by the Shira Choir, featuring Moti Steinmetz when he was quite young. That song was released in 2013. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. The new wisdom candle. Kicked off our learning last night with a Havdalah. If you missed me singing Havdalah, you didn't miss much. But we had a nice time together if you want to check that out, last night's class. And the class itself, the teaching, was a great page from the Talmud. Who's with us tonight as we get it going? Yehudit Sobel in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in the house, Pauline in Arkansas, John in Sedona, Tom says Lila Tov, Samantha says shalom everyone, Loretta and Harold in Oregon. Let me see, Bill is in Santa Fe. Well, Klein's Corners, near Santa Fe. Renee has winter white out there in Indy. Nancy in North Carolina. John says, shalom in Iowa, -8 degrees. Wow. Where am I? Sorry. Lucy in Minnesota. I'm sure it's not so warm there. Paul is talking about the cold. Crystal says, shalom. It's warming up in Canada, right? I mean, you're north of us, but it's southwest Canada where you live, right? Where am I? Rudy in Chicago, Illinois. Pearl loves the caption, I guess. And Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. Over there, Lynn is in Texas, where it's 11 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. May we all be warmed by the fire of our hearts and our fiery learning. Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to cover a decent amount of today's daf. But you know what? Before we do, mostly I'm teaching to you from the Koren Talmud with the elucidation of Rav Steinsaltz. The first time I did Daf Yomi, I went through the journey with the art scroll, which is also wonderful. And one nice feature of the art scroll is there's this prayer, which you say it's the prayer before study and the prayer after study that you would say, every day before and after study. And this is worth saying. Why don't we say it together right here? I'll say it for us. You could answer Amen. May it be your will, Hashem, my God, that a mishap not come about through me. And may I not stumble in a matter of law and cause my colleagues to rejoice over me. And may I not say regarding something which is tameh, that it is tahor, and not regarding something which is tahor, that it is tameh. Tahor, ritually pure, tameh, ritually impure. So may I not declare that something which is actually pure, that it is impure. And may I not declare that something is impure, which is actually pure. And may my colleagues not stumble in a matter of law, and I rejoice over them. For Hashem grants wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding of God. Unveil my eyes that I may perceive wonders from your Torah. We say Amen. All right. Where are we holding? Let's get the book in front of me. Here we go. This is, we're starting at the very top of page Pei Hey. That's page 85. We're in the fourth volume of the Talmud, Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 7, today completing our discussion of Mishna number 11 and opening our discussion of Mishna number 12 here in chapter 7. recall that the Mishnah we've been discussing, Mishnah 11, basically holds when do you become liable to be flogged, to receive lashes, assuming, of course, there's an appropriate warning. That if you break a bone, it's prohibited by the Torah, by the written Torah, to break a bone in the Pesach, the Passover offering, the Paschal lamb. It needs to be roasted. We've been talking about how it needs to be slaughtered, how it has to be kept in a state of ritual purity. Of course, the background to all of this is that this only is applicable. We're only obligated to do this when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. When it is, we go on the pilgrimage festival. We bring either the lamb or the goat in its first year, older than 8 days. Keep it in a state of purity, slaughtered in the temple. It has to be kept whole, has to be roasted whole, not cooked in any other way. And it is prohibited to break a bone in its body. And if one does break a bone, one is flogged. But that is assuming that you received the warning and that the offering is still tahor. It's still in a state of ritual purity. If it had become tameh, you shouldn't have allowed that to happen. But now that it's disqualified for eating, if you break a bone, which is probably still prohibited, we're not sure, but you're definitely not liable to lashes for breaking the bone in a Pesach, a Passover offering, which has already been rendered disqualified because it became tameh, because it became ritually impure. So now that we see that whether or not it's edible has some bearing on whether or not it's permitted to break a bone in its body. Of course, this is after it's been slaughtered, and we're talking about the meat of it and getting at the meat. And what we saw is even though the marrow might be tasty and edible, you can't break the bone to get at that marrow. So the marrow is not going to be considered an edible part that you can register for when a group is coming together and everybody's going to eat at least an olive-sized portion of the Paschal lamb. But now that we see that whether it's edible or not, so now the rabbis are going to start paying closer attention. Well, and we saw that the sinews don't count as edible, but the tips of the ribs and cartilage do because it's tender, and even in a grown cow, those particular parts of the mammalian body can be slow cooked for a long period of time and rendered edible. And here in the young lamb or the young goat, it's soft enough that it's definitely edible, even if it's only roasted. Okay, so we have a halacha here that if one breaks a bone in a place that does not have an olive-sized piece of meat, but there is an olive-sized piece of meat elsewhere on that bone, one is liable to be flogged, right? So if there's no meat at all on the bone, and you break that bone, okay, well, it's considered not part of the offering in such a way that because there was no meat on it. But even if there's no meat in the place where you want to break the bone, but there's meat anywhere on that bone that adds up to an olive-sized piece, and you broke that bone, you would be liable to be flogged. Assuming, of course, that there was someone there to warn you that if you do that, you're going to be flogged, and 2 witnesses saw it, and they all testify against you in a rabbinic court, then you would be liable to be flogged. We're studying the law so we understand them. This is not one that was practically applied very often, if ever. Let's continue now at the top page 85 on the A side. It is prohibited to break both a bone upon which there is an olive bulk of meat on the outside and a bone upon which there is not an olive bulk of meat on the outside, but there is an olive bulk of meat inside. What would that be? How could there be an olive bulk of meat inside a bone that has no meat on the outside? That would be the marrow. So if there's enough marrow in there to constitute an olive-sized portion of edible meat, the marrow would be that. So then if you break this bone, you would become liable to be flogged. And as a proof, the Gemara cites that which was taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, and you shall not break a bone. You shall not break a bone in it. Where am I? Hold on a second. You shall not break a bone in it, which we've seen a few times already at Exodus 12:46. This prohibition includes both a bone in which there is marrow and a bone in which there is no marrow. Now, how do I establish the positive mitzvah expressed in the verse, and they shall eat the meat on that night, it is to be fulfilled exclusively with meat that is on the bone. You can't get at the marrow since you can't break it. Now you could ask, well, maybe you can get at the marrow that's in the skull because you don't have to break the skull in order to get at it. But here, this passage seems to be suggesting that to fulfill your obligation, you're looking for meat on the bone. Meat like what was typically thought of as meat, although that would include, right, those cartilage tips, those rib tips and cartilage pieces, etc. Or perhaps it means only that the positive mitzvah also applies to the marrow meat that is inside the bone. Maybe we can use the marrow inside the bone. And if so, how do I establish the prohibition? And you shall not break a bone in it. It is referring specifically to a bone that does not have marrow. However, in case of a bone that does have marrow, perhaps then you can come and override the prohibition on breaking a bone because of the positive mitzvah of eating the meat that is inside it. And so maybe just as we set aside the prohibition of slaughtering on Shabbos in order to slaughter the Passover lamb on the afternoon of Shabbos, if Passover begins Saturday night, perhaps we'd also set aside this prohibition of breaking the bone if we were going at the marrow because it was an edible piece and more than an olive's volume. This is what the Gemara is suggesting now. And do not be surprised that one may violate the prohibition of breaking a bone in order to eat the marrow, as it is possible to say that the positive mitzvah to eat the meat comes and overrides the prohibition prohibiting one to break a bone, in accordance with the general principle that positive mitzvahs, positive obligations, override negative obligations, that thou shalt overrides thou shalt not, when those two are in conflict. When it says at Numbers 9:12, they shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break a bone in it, with regard to the Paschal lamb of the second Pesach, Pesach Sheni, right? When people are tameh, they are not qualified to participate in the first Passover because they themselves became ritually impure. Then they have to wait a month and come to the second Passover a month later, which God gave for that purpose. People who were tameh, if, for example, they had to bury a corpse and they became ritually impure from doing that very, very good deed, nevertheless, they became impure and then they would be disqualified from eating the Paschal lamb on Passover. The remedy for them is to come to second Passover. Now the Gemara is going to say, well, why, for the laws of the second Passover, does it become so specific? It could have just said, so you come a month later and you follow the same laws as the first Passover. But now that it has specified this, for the laws of the second Passover, they shall leave none of it until morning, nor break a bone in it, with regard to the Paschal lamb of the second Pesach, for which there is no need for the verse to state the prohibition, as it has already been stated, according to all the statute of the Paschal lamb, they shall keep it, with regard to which includes the prohibition to break a bone. You must say that it is repeated in order to emphasize the prohibition and indicate that it applies to both a bone in which there is marrow and a bone in which there is no marrow. We do not break a bone of the Pesach. The Gemara raises an objection to the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. If a portion of a limb, so here's a very Talmudic question, right? So now let's say that a portion of the Passover lamb, now you can take pieces apart, you just can't break a bone. So for example, you could separate a limb of the Pesach, one bone from another where it's only attached by like the sinew. You could separate the leg from the rest after it's been roasted so that you can pass out pieces, etc. So let's say that somebody is holding this limb of the Korban Pesach, like the leg of lamb, and he happens to be sitting near the edge of the boundary, in this case, Jerusalem. So he's sitting near the city line of Jerusalem. Now, if that limb of the Pesach goes outside the boundary of Jerusalem, as we've seen, it becomes disqualified. It can no longer be eaten. It has to be eaten within Jerusalem, and of course, when the temple is standing. It hasn't been in 2,000 years. But if you're sitting near the city line, and a piece of the limb goes kind of like right over the border, so some of it is still within its boundary, and some of it is outside its boundary. So the question is, so the meat that was the part of the bone and the meat on it that went outside the boundary for sure is disqualified. So the question is, well, the stuff that stayed inside the city line, that never went outside, does it become disqualified too because it's part of the same limb? Either simply because it's part of the same limb or because it's in contact with the part of the limb that went outside the boundary. That's the question that's being asked now. Where am I? The Gemara raises an objection to this view that we've been discussing. If a portion of a limb has gone out of the permissible boundary, one must cut through the meat until one reaches the bone and then peel the meat that did not go outside the boundary away from the bone until one reaches the joint and then cut off the limb. Right? So if you can, so what happens is, like, let's say that it's the leg and it has the upper leg and the lower leg, right? And it's like the lower leg is what went outside the boundary. Okay, so then you cut the meat that never went outside the boundary, you peel it back, then you go to the part of the bone that was never outside the boundary. So say the thigh bone never went outside and the shin bone did. So you can separate the bones at that joint. Okay, so we're going to discard the shin bone and its meat. We're going to set that aside and we're going to have to burn it because it's disqualified for eating. But that upper leg that never went outside the boundary, right, we separate the bone with it and that part is going to remain tahor and qualified and ready to be eaten and needs to be eaten. We're still obligated to eat it, that night, the night of Passover. So where am I? So we cut through the meat until one reaches the bone, and we peel the meat that did not go out of the boundary away from the bone until one reaches the joint, and we cut off the limb. One then eats the meat that has been detached from the bone and discards the bone and the portion of the limb that went out of the appropriate location. And so if any part of the bone was outside, that whole bone is disqualified, even if part of the bone stayed inside. And so if you say that a limb upon which there is not an olive bulk of meat in this place, but there is an olive bulk of meat in a different place, is not subject to the prohibition of breaking a bone, so then why do I need this law requiring me to peel the meat until I reach the joint and then cut off the bone? Let him peel off a bit from the section of the bone that adjoins the portion that went out of the boundary and break the bone, because once the bone is disqualified, even if there's meat on it, but if it's disqualified, maybe I can break that bone. But we have this teaching that tells us that if the bone has any pure meat on it, or any meat on it, period, you can't break that bone, right? And that's why we peel back the meat that never went outside the boundary, go back to where there's a joint, reveal the joint, take out the joint. And so this bone, any part of the bone that was outside the boundary, that and its meat are disqualified. But this meat that never went outside, that's going to remain qualified to eat. Abaye said, one may not do this due to a concern that the entire bone will crack, including a part of the bone that has meat on it. This is why you can't just cut it in the spot where maybe it would be okay to just cut it up until the point where it went outside. Just cut it right there, because now the part that's outside is disqualified and maybe now we can cut that bone. Abaye says no, even if that were somehow permitted, there's a risk that you would crack the part of the bone that never went outside, and then you would be breaking a bone of qualified meat. Ravina said the ruling was stated with regard to a thigh bone, which has a large amount of marrow in it. It cannot be broken, even if one peels away the meat from the location of the break. We learned in a Mishna there, at the end of the tractate, pigul and leftover sacrificial meat. Okay, so these two concepts often travel together, pigul and nosar. So pigul, well, let's start with nosar. So nosar is leftover meat. Now, as we've seen with the Paschal lamb, anything that's left over, that the group that's registered to eat that Passover lamb, if they didn't eat it that night, the first night of Passover, anything left over in the morning becomes prohibited for eating, and it's going to have to be disposed of by burning. This is also true with respect to other offerings that are eaten by people, right? So there's certain, like a peace offering, the chagiga, the festival peace offerings, have portions, large portions that are eaten by the owners that bring it. There's also a time limit. It's not the same time limit as the Passover offering where you have to eat it all that night. With the Chagiga, you have 2 nights and a day. So it's a longer time period and the deadline is pushed off. But nevertheless, a deadline comes by which all that meat has to have been eaten by the end of the second night after it's slaughtered. And at that point, anything that's left over is disqualified. It has to be burned. It cannot be eaten. That's called nosar. Pigul is if, for example, when the priest was slaughtering it and receiving its blood, he was thinking about the wrong kind of offering. He thought it was a chagiga when in fact it was a Pesach. So he was thinking at the time that he slaughtered it and brought the blood to the altar, oh, that I have 2 nights in which to eat the priestly portion of this, or whatever is going to be given to the priests, or even that the other people have 2 nights to eat it. So because he has the wrong intention about that offering, he wasn't careful to know what kind of offering he's bringing to the altar when he's going to bring a little bit of its blood to the altar. It is disqualified for erroneous intent by the priest bringing it. That's called pigul. So we learned in a Mishna there at the end of the tractate, pigul and nosar, so wrongly intended meat, according to the intention of the priest, and meat that was left over beyond its deadline for eating. If somebody touches them, they render the hands impure. Now, this is meat that was not impure. It didn't come into it is tahor. It did not come into contact with some source of impurity, either a tamei person or tamei food. A person that was tamei by virtue of touching a corpse or touching a creeping thing, etc. The meat never came into contact with impurity, but once it's disqualified, whether because of the priest's wrongful intent at the time that he brought it, or because it was left over past its deadline for eating, at that point, it's going to be considered tamei by rabbinic decree. The rabbis decree that it is now tamei, and it renders the hands that touch it tamei. The hands, not the whole body, apparently. So that means that you have to wash your hands to reattain that level of purity. But the hands are going to be rendered tamei. This is a rabbinic decree on leftover meat or wrongly intended meat at the time that it was slaughtered. So the question is, why did the rabbis make this decree? Rav Huna and Rav Chisda disagreed with regard to the reason for this. One said the reason is due to priests who were suspected of purposely disqualifying the offerings of people they disliked with improper intentions. What an awful thing to suspect the priests of. And the sages decreed that the disqualified offerings immediately render the hands of the priests impure as a penalty, so that they shouldn't think to themselves, oh, I don't like that guy. If I just think about the wrong kind of offering, I'm going to disqualify it. I'm going to tell him, I'm sorry, I had the wrong intention. Sorry, what can I do? And now it's too late for him to go find another offering. He's really in a bad bind because this priest messed him up. Right? And to make sure that the priest would be careful and not make that mistake, whether they made it intentionally because they didn't care for the person bringing the offering, or unintentionally because they were careless, that we want to impose a bit of a penalty on them, that if they have that wrong intention at the time of bringing the offering, and they discovered and they were holding that offering, they were touching it or its blood, that their hands now become tamei, and they're going to have to deal with that. They have to stop the work that they're doing. They're going to be embarrassed. They're going to have to go deal with their hands, etc. And one said, the other one who disputed this point, so Rav Huna made the first, and Rav Chisda said, the reason is due to lazy priests. The decree is meant to stop them from allowing offerings to go uneaten, right? So especially with the leftover offerings, they should make sure that they find the people who are going to eat them. With the Paschal offering, that's up to the group registered for it. But other kinds of offerings that also have a deadline for eating, they should make sure that there's going to be people there to eat it. Or if there's some offerings, only the priests can eat of their meat. And they should make sure that there's enough priests around to get that meat eaten, as it were. So the Gemara explains that these two positions don't really argue with each other. One sage is teaching his reason with regard to pigul, that they shouldn't have the wrong intention at the time of bringing the offering, and the other sage teaches his reason with regard to nasar, to leftover sacrificial meat. The one who teaches the reason with regard to pigul says the decree is due to priests suspected of purposely disqualifying offerings via improper intentions, as an offering only becomes pigul through intent. And the one who teaches the reason with regard to leftover sacrificial meat, nasar, that it makes the hands tamei that touch it, it is due to lazy priests who would not eat the meat or make sure that it had been eaten. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to sacrificial meat that has gone out of its permitted boundaries. Did the sages decree that it attains ritual impurity or not? So we've seen that a sacrifice of Pesach, that some of it or all of it went outside its boundary, right? So outside of the city of Jerusalem, it becomes disqualified. The group that was registered to it can no longer eat it and fulfill their obligations to eat part of the Passover offering on Passover night. The meat is now disqualified. It needs to be burned. The question is, did the sages further decree that anyone who touches this meat that became disqualified because it was carried outside the boundary of Jerusalem, whether intentionally or unintentionally, one who's holding that meat, handling that meat, do their hands become tameh, and they're going to have to go through a purification process, probably just washing and saying a blessing, but at least they have to go through some kind of a purification process because their hands have become tameh by rabbinic decree. Did the sages decree that on meat that has left its boundary? This is the question. So do we say that a decree had to be made with regard to leftover sacrificial meat, as the priests would come to be lazy about it and not eat it? But with regard to sacrificial meat that went out of its boundary, there is no concern. There's no reason for concern, because the priests would not actively take it out of the boundaries of Jerusalem and thereby disqualify it. And therefore, the sages did not decree, or in terms of sacrificial meat that had to actually be eaten in the temple, they certainly wouldn't walk it outside of the temple precincts, right? So that's different than the Paschal lamb, but other offerings have to be eaten within the temple precincts. So, but the point is, maybe we don't have to be worried about declaring tuma on the hands of the people who handle this offering that became disqualified because it went outside of its boundary, whether it's the kind of offering whose boundary is the temple or the kind of offering whose boundary is all of Jerusalem. Still, we don't have to worry about that because the people are going to be careful not to remove the meat from its boundaries. So the rabbis didn't have to instill this further decree to incentivize them to be careful not to take the meat out of its boundary. Again, so the way it's written here, but with regard to sacrificial meat that has gone out, there's no reason for concern because priests would not actively take it out of its boundary and thereby disqualified. And therefore, the sages did not decree that it be considered ritually impure. Or perhaps it is no different, as the sages decreed that all disqualified sacrificial meat be considered ritually impure, whether it was disqualified by becoming tameh, or it was disqualified because a bone had been broken in it, or disqualified because it was carried out of its boundary. In all these cases, perhaps they decreed that the hands that touch it become tameh. That's the question that has been asked. Now the discussion continues. If one removes the meat of a Paschal lamb from the location, so to get at whether they're going to render the hands tameh for meat that leaves its boundary where it can be eaten, we're going to go to something related, a similar kind of boundary. If one removes the meat of a Paschal lamb from the location, this is not a boundary, but from the location of one group to the location of another group, right? So the Paschal lamb obviously is not bounded. The place of its eating is not bounded by the temple precincts. You slaughter it there. The priest dashed some of its blood on the altar, and then the agent who took it in there to be slaughtered, the member of the group who was deputized to do that, carries it back out of the temple and goes to where the group is going to be having their barbecue that night of the first night of Passover. They're going to have that. They're going to roast that lamb in a location. And there's, hundreds or thousands of these groups there that night, the first night of Passover in Jerusalem, when the temple is standing. And so you have your location, your campsite, and then nearby there's another campsite. So what if you take some of the meat from your Pesach, from your campsite to a neighboring campsite? Now you can see why the rabbis might make a decree to prevent that from happening, because we know that the only people permitted to eat from a Passover lamb are the group of people who registered to eat from that Passover lamb. And if we're going to take some of that roasted meat into another campsite, it could so easily become confused with the meat of the people of the lamb in that campsite. So surely they're going to want to keep them separate. But what's the penalty if that happens? So if one removes the meat of a Paschal lamb from the location of one group to the location of another group, although he violates a prohibition, as the Torah prohibits removing the Paschal lamb from the location of the group that registered for it, not just a prohibition of the rabbis, it's a Torah prohibition. Prohibits moving the paschal lamb from the location of the group that registered for it. The paschal lamb remains pure. There's no decree that it becomes tameh or renders hands tameh when it goes from one place to the other. It is prohibited to do this, but it's not like the meat becomes tameh. It might become disqualified for eating, but it doesn't become ritually impure such that it could even transmit that ritual impurity. Whew. Hold on. It does not. It remains pure. The Gemara seeks to clarify. What? Is it not that the meat remains pure and yet it is prohibited to eat it? Because a paschal lamb that goes from the location of one group to that other group is comparable to any offering that goes out of its boundary and it is disqualified, right? So now that we've seen that meat goes from its correct permitted location to another prohibited location, it becomes disqualified, but it does not become tameh. So maybe meat that goes out of its boundary, say the paschal lamb that passed out of the city limits of Jerusalem, that it would become disqualified, but maybe we don't say that it is tameh and renders hands impure like these other disqualifications that we've been talking about. That's one side of the argument. Even so, it is teaching that the meat remains pure. Apparently, based on this, it seems that the sages did not decree ritual impurity on meat that goes out of the location of its group. But the Gemara rejects this proof. No, the Baraisa should be understood as teaching that the meat is pure and permitted to be eaten because meat that goes from the location of one group to the location of another group is not comparable to sacrificial meat that goes out of its boundary, and it is not even disqualified. You shouldn't do that because it might get mixed up, but it's not like it's left its boundary and it doesn't even become disqualified. It's just to bring it back, make sure it doesn't get confused with the other group's meat, and should come back to the location and be eaten there by the people registered to it. But the previous answers end up being withdrawn in favor of the following. With regard to meat that goes out of its location, that is from the paschal lamb, it is not necessary for us to say that the sages did not decree ritual impurity on it, because it is obvious. What is the reason that the sages did not decree it to be ritually impure, tameh, and transmitting that impurity? It is because the members of the group are zealous. They're very careful to ensure that the meat remains in its proper location, making it unnecessary to penalize those who allow the meat to leave the location of its group. Rather, when this question was asked, it was with regard to other sacrificial meat that has gone out of its boundary. What is the halacha? The Gemara does not have an answer to this question and concludes, teku, let it stand. So we're just not going to get an answer on whether meat that goes outside of the boundary is going to impart ritual impurity in the same way that other disqualifications like breaking a bone, as pigul and nosar, erroneous intent, or leaving it over beyond its deadline, the sages did decree that those will will have and transmit ritual impurity. But with respect to meat that has left its boundary, we don't know if the sages decreed that it would be tameh. On the law of this, if meat from a paschal lamb is taken out of the area in which its group is sitting, it may no longer be eaten. It is treated like other sacrificial meat that is taken out of its boundary. It must be burned, and one who eats it is liable to be flogged. So it is disqualified, and once it's disqualified, if you eat it, you're flogged. But it does not seem to, we don't know if it does, and therefore we don't say that it imparts ritual impurity if you just touch it. Meat that goes out of its location from the paschal lamb. A paschal lamb that is taken out of the location where its group is eating, it may no longer be eaten, but it remains ritually pure. The sages did not decree ritual impurity because the members of the group are generally zealous in ensuring the proper treatment of the offering. So it seems like we did get a resolution on this, at least in terms of how the law is going to be applied. It does not become impure or transmit its impurity. We move on to Mishnah number 12. We're going to read Mishnah number 12 and just open the discussion about it. And then if you have questions or comments, get them in there now because I'm coming to you. And here we're going to get the title of today's episode. Does an iron barrier have the power to stop a priestly blessing? Or is the priestly blessing like some kind of a super powerful, neutron ray that can shoot through even an iron barrier? Let's see. The Mishnah. If a portion of a limb has gone out of its permissible boundary, one must cut the meat until one reaches the bone. So we've already seen this teaching. Now this is the Mishnah. If a portion of a limb has gone out of its permissible boundary, one must cut the meat until one reaches the bone at the point that separates between the part of the limb that went out of its boundary and the part that did not. And then peel the meat away from the bone until one reaches the joint. Cut off the limb at the joint, as it is prohibited to break the bone itself. And with regard to other offerings, one may chop off the part that exited with a hatchet, as it is not subject to the prohibition of breaking a bone. So it's only with the Pesach that you can't break a bone. So if you have like the leg of lamb and the thigh stayed inside Jerusalem and the shin went outside of Jerusalem and somebody's near the border, they got halfway out and they're like, oh my God, I can't carry this out. And only part of the limb went out. So the shin for sure is disqualified, but the part of the thigh that never went out, you make a cut right there, you peel the meat back, then you separate that thigh bone from whatever it's attached to further in, get rid of the bone, the whole bone, even though only part of that bone was outside of Jerusalem, take the whole bone with the meat that went outside, that's going to have to be burned and discarded. But the meat that never left, we can keep it, we can save it and use it and feed it to the people who are registered for that Paschal lamb. And with regard to other offerings where there is no prohibition not to break the bone, then you could just take a hatchet and break it right there, right on the line. Everything that stayed in is still qualified. Everything that went out, disqualified. How does one determine the outer boundaries of a particular location? And now, have you left Jerusalem or have you left a particular boundary? And what we're going to look at is doorways. So, the outside the wall is outside the boundary. Inside the wall is inside the boundary. But what about the thickness of the wall? The thickness of the doorway? Is the doorway itself considered inside or outside, so that someone who only goes into the doorway or into the thickness of the wall but never passes to the outside, has he been deemed to have left Jerusalem or not? As you can imagine, this is a question that's going to have ramifications beyond the law of the Paschal lamb. In fact, it's going to have ramifications for the question, if 9 men are praying together and there's a 10th guy who should be, they want to deem him part of their group so that they can say the prayers that require a quorum of 10 men, a minyan, but he's not in the same room with them. Rather, he's standing in the doorway, right? And it's a thick wall, so he's like literally in the thickness of the door, the thickness of the wall. Is he in the same space with them or not? That's what we're learning here. So how does one determine the outer boundaries of a particular location? Anything that is located from the inside of the doorway inward is considered as though it is inside. And anything that is located from the doorway outward is considered as though it is outside. And the windows in the wall and the thickness of the wall are considered as though they are inside, such that an offering is considered to have exited the premises only if it is taken outside the wall. So if you're standing within the thickness of the wall, you're still deemed to be inside. You haven't left that place. Gemara. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, and the halakha is similar with regard to prayer, in that one who is standing outside the doorway cannot be included together with those who are praying inside. And the Gemara notes that Rav disagrees with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Right, so Rav is an Amora, and he's disagreeing with a Tana, a rabbi of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, even a barrier of iron does not separate between the Jewish people and their Father in heaven. Barriers are irrelevant with regard to prayer. Right? Now that is going to be true with regard to the blessings of the priests, right? So the Kohanim, when the temple was standing, and even today, right, at holidays, and actually every day in Israel, but outside of Israel, we do this on holidays, on festivals, that during the Musaf Amida, if there are Kohanim in the room, right, Cohens, descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, so they're called Cohens or Kohanim, right? So a Jew named Cohen is a descendant of Aaron. And there are other names that are often associated with, it's not always the case, but usually people like have a name Rappaport or I think Kagan. There's a few others. They're Kohanim. And so those people, they're called up to give a blessing to the congregation during certain holiday services. They're going to take off their shoes. They're going to say a blessing before they speak the priestly blessing. They're actually going to cover themselves up with their prayer shawls, and we in the congregation are going to cover ourselves up with our prayer shawls because you cannot look into the eyes of a priest when he's blessing you. That's a tradition. And then he'll say the formula that's in the Torah. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you. May the Lord favor you and grant you shalom. Of course, they'll say that in Hebrew. That's the priestly blessing. According to this teaching, even if there's a wall between the priests giving the blessing and you receiving it, the wall is ineffective. Even a barrier of iron is ineffective. But for 10 men to be counted as standing in the same location, no, there can't be a wall between them. They need to be in the same room to be considered a quorum. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, even a barrier of iron does not separate between the Jewish people and their Father in heaven. Barriers are irrelevant with regard to prayer. The Gemara questions the Mishna. This matter itself is difficult. The Mishna itself contains an internal contradiction. At first you said that the space from the doorway inward is considered as though it's inside, which indicates that the space of the doorway itself is like the outside. Now you say the latter clause of the Mishnah's ruling, which states that from the doorway outward is considered as though it is outside, which indicates that the door itself is considered as though it's inside. And the Gemara answers, La kasha, it is not difficult, as one can explain that these two statements are referring to different situations. Here in the first clause of the Mishnah's ruling is referring to the gates of the temple courtyard, where the inside of the doorways were considered as though they were inside the courtyard and had the sanctity of the courtyard. There, in the latter clause, it's discussing the gates of Jerusalem, where the outsides of the gates were considered like the outside and did not have the sanctity of Jerusalem. So let's read. There's a few halachas on this. Inside and outside. Anything located inside of the doorway is considered to be inside, while anything located in the doorway or outside is considered to be outside. So the halacha, it seems like at the end, the way it was taught, the way Rambam teaches it, is that in the doorway itself is considered like the outside, right? So if you're in the thickness of the wall, it's actually considered like you're outside, like the gates of Jerusalem. But with respect, at least to the courtyard of the temple itself, okay, there the doorways have the sanctity of the inside of the temple. And the halacha is similar with regard to prayer. All 10 members of a prayer quorum must be in the same location. One who is standing in a doorway is considered to be outside of the room. But with regard to the priestly blessings, even if a wall separates the priests from the rest of the congregation, it does not prevent the blessings from taking effect. That's how powerful something like this. You know, I'm not a Cohen, so I don't know how to do this, but I think it's something like this. This is the combination, and they would bless the people. This is the way the priest did it when the temple was standing. Now the Kohanim just blessed with the prayer shawls over their bodies. But in the ancient days, it was something like that, and they would bless all the people. And then even if there was a wall between the priest doing that blessing and the people, the power of the blessing could not be stopped. All right. Let us check your comments and questions. Where am I? I just want to see the time. Okay, we're doing all right. Okay, Tom Beck. What if you already ate your morsel of the Pesach or Hagiga? Have you retroactively failed to perform the mitzvah? You mean if you already ate it and then it became disqualified? So if it became disqualified after you ate it, not a problem, right? What you ate was qualified. If you found out that what you ate had already been disqualified at the time that you ate it, it seems like in most cases you have not fulfilled your obligation. And if you're not going to be able to fulfill it at that Passover because there's not more meat of the lamb that you registered for, then yeah, you would have to return for the second Passover. But we've seen that there was, at least some cases, right, where if it was tomb of the deep and you found out that it had become tameh with tomb of the deep, the kind of tumor that nobody could have known about it because the person who brought it in the first place to Jerusalem, stepped over an unknown grave that later, after he walked over it and after it was slaughtered and then the meat was roasted and everybody ate it, somebody comes in and says, anybody who brought their lamb via this path on the outskirts of Jerusalem, which is near here and here, it turns out they were doing some road work and they found a grave there near the end of the day. So there was tumah. Everybody walked over a grave, but that was a grave nobody knew about. And so that would be tomb of the deep. And for that kind of disqualification, I think it would be considered that you still did fulfill your obligation and you don't have to come back for that second Passover. I'm pretty sure that's how I remember we did a few weeks ago. Sharon, since I am assuming that the origin of the regulation of eating the Paschal lamb in its place is derived from the time of the Exodus and the fear of the angel of death outside the home, what is the concern in temple times? Well, see, I think really what it is, that makes sense what you're saying, but I think actually the practical reason why you can't leave your place is that the meat might become confused with the meat in the neighboring campsites, right? So once it goes into that group's locale, it's got to be kept there so that they are only eating the meat that they registered for and not of their neighbor and vice versa, I think. Michael Diamond, is this prohibition just for taking the Pesach offering out of Jerusalem or also for taking it outside the house where the group is eating? Right, so I think you must have asked that question earlier. Now it's been basically answered, right? So if you take it outside of your group's location, is it disqualified? One opinion was that it remains pure and you can eat it, but actually it seems like if it goes out of your location, it is disqualified. And then if you ate it anyway, knowing it was disqualified, you could even be flogged for it. So you can't leave that location. And finally, Sharon, the issue of being in the same space is huge for a minyan in a cemetery. Does everyone in the minyan need to be at the graveside, or can you count all who are inside the cemetery wall? This is critical for the ability to say Kaddish and other memorial prayers. Exactly. If you want to say Kaddish, the prayer of mourning that we say for one who has died, but you need 10 men as a minyan to be there. What if you have 6 guys who are there together at your prayer service at the graveside? You'd like to say, the son might want to say Kaddish for the father, for example. And if they don't have 10 men, then he can't say Kaddish. But what if or have good reason to believe that, it's a big cemetery and there's other Jewish men in that cemetery? Can they be counted? I haven't read up on the laws, on the nuances of this law, so I'm not going to say what the halacha is exactly on is it enough that they're in the cemetery wall or do they have to be at that graveside? But as you say, it's a very practical and important question that has real ramifications for a family that's just gone through a death and would like to say Kaddish. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. A big happy birthday to Yitzi Hurwitz. I forgot to mention at the top of the show, we're dedicating tonight's learning to him. Nina will put there in the comments the link to sign up to do good deeds in Yitzi's name. That's what he wants for his birthday. If people say they're going to do a mitzvah they wouldn't otherwise do, this is possible for both Jews and non-Jews. You can do a deed of loving kindness for people out there, for anyone. Just pledge to do it. It could also be Jews that do apply to mitzvahs that do apply to Jews, like lighting Shabbos candles for the women or wrapping tefillin for the men or for anybody. Jew or non-Jew, to give charity or give a little extra charity. You can sign up there, and we want to reach that target of the thousands of mitzvahs that Yitzi would love to see people sign up for and pledge to do. I personally have pledged to give a little extra charity every day for 10 days, so that's 10 mitzvahs on the mitzvah counter there for Yitzi's birthday. And may the merit of our learning tonight accrue to Yitzi's credit both in this world and the world to come. Have a great night, my holy sisters and brothers. I look forward to learning with you again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m.